it's not the glamorous work that people think it is. It can be grueling and dangerous.
Hello and welcome to Tech Won't Save Us. I'm your host, Marx, and this week my guest is Anousha Sakoui. Anousha is a reporter at the LA Times where she covers the behind the scenes of Hollywood, and she was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2022. You might remember in 2021, some workers in Hollywood with the IATSE union were about to go on strike as they were negotiating for a better deal with an alliance of movie studios. They didn't end up doing that, but it brought a lot of attention to the labor conditions in Hollywood and how streaming in particular has been changing the way that Hollywood works and the way that workers in that industry are compensated. Well, in the next few months, 3 more major unions are going to renegotiate their contracts with the studios. And that means that there's a possibility that another strike could be in the offing. In particular, the Writers Guild of America, which is the most likely to strike, has to renegotiate their contract in the next few months. And that means that if they are not able to get the studios to agree with their demands and to set a fair model for the industry, it's likely that those workers could be back on the picket line like they were in 2007. Now, this is a really important conversation, and even though it seems like, an entertainment industry and Hollywood conversation, it's still very much connected to the tech industry as well, because a lot of these transformations, a lot of these changes, a lot of these problems that workers are experiencing are the result of how much production has shifted from, traditional cinema showing or going on broadcast or cable television over to streaming services, and that has changed the model of how these productions work, how these workers are paid, and just how the industry works on a more basic level. So in this conversation, I wanted to discuss that with Anousha so that we could have that context as these negotiations get closer, and so that we can understand how streaming and how companies like Netflix and even Apple and Amazon and these other more traditional entertainment companies, as they have moved into streaming, are transforming the industry and are able to use their power and their influence as they have consolidated to try to push workers and to reduce their compensation and make their working conditions not as good as they used to be. So it's an important conversation. I was really excited to talk to Anousha about it and to really get into the details. Certainly, we start with laying a bit of the groundwork just by outlining what these unions are, how they came to be, and who they represent. And then we really get into the nitty-gritty of why these strikes are happening, how this kind of carve out, how this different designation for streaming productions was made, and why these unions are looking to change it now, and whether they're going to be successful at that. So if you like this conversation, make sure to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also share it on social media or with any friends or colleagues who you think would learn from it. And if you want to make sure we can keep having these critical conversations about important issues that tech is involved in, even when it's not, just about Silicon Valley, like in this case, you can join supporters like Tom from New York, Ben from Finland, and Ran from Berlin by going to patreon.com/techwon'tsaveuss, where you can sign up. Thanks so much and enjoy this week's conversation. Anousha, welcome to Tech Won't Save Us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to chat. You wrote this piece recently about the Directors Guild and the Writers Guild and, these upcoming negotiations that are about to happen in Hollywood as these unions try to fight for some better terms because their contracts are coming up for renewal. And there's a whole load of kind of topics enmeshed in these negotiations, what's going on here. And there's a big link to the move to streaming, how popular streaming has become in recent years and what that has meant for workers in Hollywood. So I want to dig into all of this with you. But because a lot of the listeners will be more familiar with the tech industry than the entertainment industry, I wanted to start by getting some insight into what labor in Hollywood actually looks like. So I was hoping you could kind of lay the groundwork for us and tell us what are the various unions that exist in Hollywood and who do they represent?
So Hollywood is very heavily unionized, which I think might be a surprise to some people, but the unions are very powerful and most of the industry, is represented by unions, although they're still making some efforts to cover new grounds like SAG-AFTRA, which represents actors, for example, and is Hollywood's biggest union. They are moving more into, say, the area of podcasting, for example.
I'll have to join up.
Yeah. Then there's the Writers Guild of America, which has a West and East faction, but they are kind of seen as, they obviously represent writers for TV and film. They are seen as maybe the most militant of the unions because they've gone on strike the most in this past sort of like 100 years or so forth. And then you have the Directors Guild of America, which represents directors, but also directors' team members. So that's like assistant directors and unit production managers, who are the people who run the day-to-day productions of a film or TV program. The Directors Guild of America is interesting because compared to maybe, say, SAG-AFTRA or the Writers Guild, supposedly more of their members are working members. So if you can imagine with, say, SAG-AFTRA, maybe not all actors are working all the time. That's one of the things that sort of gets talked about. And then there's IATSE, which we call, or IATSCE, which stands for the International Alliance of Theatrical Stagehands Employees, something like that.
Theatrical stage employees, yeah.
That's it. I always have to look it up, strangely, even though I've been doing this for years. So that is a huge union which represents what we call below the line, or basically behind the scenes sort of crew members. So crafts like hairdressing and makeup, production design, script supervisors, electricians, all sorts. And then there's some other, there's also there's the Teamsters have a Hollywood chapter, and there's the Animation Guild. So there's other smaller unions as well, but those are the main ones. And IATSE is probably characterized by being probably the least militant of all of them. It's the one that's really never gone on strike. You have to go back really to its founding to find any kind of walkouts of on a national level. They do walk out in sometimes for on specific programs, and on every major TV or film production is a signatory to their contracts. Some low budget productions, or notably reality shows, non-scripted productions, tend to be non-union, but the big things that you're watching on Netflix, or you go to the movies, they tend to be union productions.
That's really interesting. And I feel like some of the names there, like the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, kind of tells you how old these unions actually are in some cases, been around for quite a long time and have evolved as the industry has kind of changed, as new technologies have changed the way that entertainment works, and they've kind of adjusted to that. Some people might look at that and say, unionization has gone down a lot in the US and Canadian economies over the past number of decades, because I believe many or all of these unions also extend to Canada or have Canadian chapters or what have you. Why is the entertainment industry so heavily unionized compared to maybe other industries?
It's a good question. And if anything, they are expanding, right? Like they are growing in the areas that they're looking at, they're organizing. I think part of it is that, this is an industry where maybe people can take advantage a lot, like people would have you working for free on whatever project. And I think that's part of the reason people have, really needed the protection and to create some kind of standardization for whether it's, an actor or writer. I think that's part of it. I came to LA from London, and it was surprising to me. I didn't realize how heavily unionized it was. And if you compare it to, say, the UK production scene, it's not as unionized. The unions there are much smaller. There is a union for film production, but it's much smaller than here in LA. So yeah, I think that's part of the driving factor.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, right? And just to throw like a devil's advocate question at you so that, we have it covered and then we'll move on to talking about these negotiations a bit. Some people might think about this and say, why do actors need a union? Why do directors need a union? They're paid so much. What would be the response to that? It's probably quite obvious, but
Well, people who make it very big in Hollywood, who are what you'd call A-list, they might get paid a lot. And even then, I think even the biggest performers that we know, like, that firstly, it's this tiny number. And everybody else, they need, what they call the basic agreement, which is protection in terms of like a minimum amount of pay. Also the hours. Last year when there was the IATSE tensions, it really came out how many hours the crew work. I mean, you're talking like 14, 16-hour days. So the contracts, they also protect them from the number of hours that they have to work. It gives them a minimum, and actors as well, it gives them a minimum amount of what we call turnaround, which is the amount of time they can have off between they have to come back on set. And I think productions are sometimes these things that, like, they're not necessarily that, they can be run by anyone. It's not necessarily these big conglomerates as a lot of the big studios are now, but small independent productions where they might want to film around the clock to get stuff done on a very tight budget. So these unions provide the workers in the different areas protections like that.
And just the final piece of this, those are the various unions that exist. But then there's also an organization that represents the various studios, the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, AMPTP. Anything in particular we should know about them?
Yeah. So Hollywood studios, and that makeup has been changing over time, and we should definitely talk about that. There are sort of two different bodies that sort of represent them. They're trade organizations. So the AMPTP is effectively the face of the employers in labor negotiations. And it negotiates on behalf of the studios in every 3 years or whenever the contracts come up. And they represent the biggest studios. But more recently, that's included Netflix, Apple, and Amazon. And I think that's quite interesting, how that body effectively has evolved as you've gotten more participants who, that they're typically not unionized, and they don't come from a unionized industry. And then there's also the Motion Picture Association, which is just another sort of general trade body for Hollywood. But in negotiation for labor, it's the AMPTP.
Interesting. Okay. So, as you mentioned there, and as we've discussed, and as people have probably seen in the news, there has been a growing kind of contentious relationship, I guess, between the unions and between the MPTP, these studios, because of how the nature of work in the industry has been changing, as streaming has grown, but also as some of these other issues have become something that, the workers feel really need to be dealt with. And so I want to go back to 2007 briefly, because you mentioned that the Writers Guild is the most kind of activist of these unions, has been most likely to go on strike. And 2007 was the last time they went on strike over contract negotiations to try to win certain things. And one of the things that came out of that period, and it's unclear to me whether it was the Directors Guild or the Writers Guild that actually kind of achieved this first, or if that even matters, but was the designation of new media, which covered a lot of these kind of digital services, including streaming services, as I understand. Can you tell us a bit about what went on in that period and why the new media designation was important to come out of those negotiations?
2007 was a kind of pivotal time. Technology-wise, there have been a few pivots, when you go to the creation of VHS and then DVD. But 2007 and 2008, it was the year that Netflix started going to produce or distribute its content to the internet and away from DVDs. Hulu went live in 2008. At that time, writers were looking at the internet and seeing, Apple was selling movies via the internet, that you could download. And they were concerned about how they were going to get paid. There is this sort of constant shift of technology that's happening faster than their contracts can evolve and how the pay structure can evolve. And so for years, really, they have been worried about being left behind by this technology. And so 2007 really became a very important point in labor negotiations in Hollywood because it became a 100-day walkout. It was very painful, the local economy. And I suppose the Writers Guild led it, it's sort of like nearly 10,000 members, and it shut down, more than 60 shows. So it had a very big impact. And that strike has become the big comparison for anything that has happened since, any kind of negotiations that have happened since. I mean, a lot was lost as well, nearly 40,000 jobs, about $2 billion estimated in lost output through that year. If it happened again now, I think the industry has changed a bit. A lot of it's shifted away from Los Angeles to other hubs like Georgia and New York. Yeah, that strike was critical in getting a piece of that pie, basically what we call streaming now, and making sure that writers and directors and actors get paid for their content and for their performances for when that content plays out on streaming. Now, obviously, to this day, that remains sort of contentious how much of that pie they're getting. But this was their sort of like first piece of it. It's a pivotal strike for that reason.
And maybe it's worth kind of drilling down on that point for just a second as well, because what you're talking about here is residuals, right? Obviously these workers do get paid for doing the work on this, but then there's an ongoing payment as rights continued to be sold, as those movies or TV shows continued to be shown, and that is what these workers could expect. That went into funding their benefits, their pensions, all these sorts of things. And one of the concerns as things have moved to streaming and moved online is that there's far less of these residuals because of how the business model has changed. So do you want to describe to us exactly what those residuals are and how it has changed as things have, gone digital?
I mean, sort of harking back a bit to the beginning when we were talking about like when people think about actors or directors and they're thinking about Steven Spielberg or Scarlett Johansson, they're thinking, oh, they're getting millions. But the vast majority of directors or actors, their career pay is, if they get a hit, maybe they get one, and that will support them for many years through this process of residuals, which is effectively fees for the reuse of their content. So it used to be that every time your TV show or film was shown on a network, you would get paid a fee. But now the evolution of technology and streaming has sort of muddied that. And not just streaming, but also some of the consolidation that's happened in Hollywood. So with streaming, you don't have the same, at the present, insight into who's viewing your content, how many people, how many times. All that kind of data is not easily available. There's still a battle over that. And also there's an issue now of, say, Netflix, just as an example, but it really applies to all studios now. They produce and distribute the content. So there is this sort of vertical integration that's happened, and it's happened at all the studios where they all now own their own streaming platforms, where it's like, okay, are there arm's length deals happening where the producer is selling its content to a distributor, and the people that are creating that content now have less insight into that deal making. And these residuals are really valuable. I mean, they're the things that have made Jerry Seinfeld rich, for example. They were huge amounts of money when TV shows were syndicated and resold, every time. One thing that might be helpful to think about is when we talk about content, we talk about windows. And so we'd have the theatrical window, say for a movie, which would be the first window. And that would be the first place where it's shown. And then you might have home video, and then you might have television, and then DVD, for example. But today, Netflix, I mean, I'm picking on Netflix a lot, but they obviously were a leader in this. They will buy the rights for the whole world to be exclusive on their platform. And so the windowing system has completely changed. So you'd see there are so many different factors there in terms of effectively how streaming has completely upended the economics of Hollywood. So that's a story about residuals, and it's sort of like one factor, but it tells you how things have changed so completely in terms of how people get paid in Hollywood.
Yeah, and it's really important, right? Because as you describe, not everyone is the Steven Spielbergs, not everyone is like the Brad Pitts, the people who get paid a lot to do these films. There's also a lot of other actors or even directors, or, as you say, the kind of IATSE below the line kind of craftspeople and things like that who aren't necessarily getting these massive payments, but then are dependent on these residuals being there as they've worked on a number of projects to be able to, give them a bit more of an ongoing income to ensure that their pensions and their benefits are funded and all these sorts of things. And the switch to streaming and the reduction of those residuals creates a real big threat for them and their livelihoods, or their, the things that they thought they would be able to depend on later in life when they're not doing so much work. And so to connect to that, I think, is really, as you brought up earlier, the IATSE strike, or the threat of a strike in 2021, I believe it was, when those workers were going through their contract negotiations. And for a while there, it looked like they probably were going to go on strike because they weren't getting what they wanted from the AMPTP in these negotiations. Can you tell us a bit about what happened in that period, what these workers, what this union was really looking for and fighting for, the residuals, but other things as well, and what actually happened there?
That was a kind of fascinating year because the year before, there had already been one round of negotiations with the writers, actors, and directors. They negotiate basically every 3 years, the directors, and then the year after is when IATSE negotiates. So this year, when we'll have the writers, directors, and actors renegotiating, and then next year we'll already be back at IATSE's contract. In 2020, the pandemic had obviously kicked off, and there was, people were expecting there to be a writer strike. That didn't happen.
Yeah, and just to pick up on that, it didn't happen because the expectation was the strike was going to happen. The contract renewal is usually around May or June. Then the pandemic hits in March. And so it takes all the steam out of that, right?
Yeah. Really, there would have been nothing to walk out of effectively had they. So it removed any kind of ability to threaten strike or for a strike to have any impact. And so, you walk into the IATSE negotiations, and it was a very different year. A lot had happened. As I said earlier, they're seen as the least militant, least likely to strike, least likely to rock the boat. In some part, maybe that's because, well, it has a very long history, and you go back to the 30s and 40s, and it was one of its sort of earlier formations was, effectively controlled by the Chicago Mafia, where they were suppressing wages in exchange for kickbacks from the studios. And so it has this long history. And obviously, now that doesn't have those links. I think maybe some people think that's the reason why, that they don't rock the boat as much. I think it's more to do with the fact that there are so many different crafts, so many different chapters. And this year they decided to work all together. And also there was a sort of grassroots campaign through social media, different factions, and in fact, one group in particular called IA Stories. IA is short for effectively IATSE, where people started to share anonymously what it's like to work on a film set. And it is dangerous, and can be grueling. And, for decades, actually, people have talked about, literally dying in their jobs because, for example, they work these crazy long hours and then they have to commute. And so, people either die sometimes behind the wheel driving, commuting, or they have, that lots of reports of like near misses, people sort of waking up at the wheel. So, it's quite serious. And, it's always good to remember that these are sets where you've got like heavy machinery, cabling, it's dangerous. So maybe with the influence of the pandemic, people were really exhausted, and the pandemic had an impact of not just a moment of shutdown, but the industry got back to work very quickly, and people were working extremely hard because there was a period of catch up. So there was like a confluence of not only pressure from studios where, there's a lot to get filmed and catch up on, but also this is a freelance sort of type of work. So I think people were working nonstop, instead of having breaks like they might do, they were going from job to job to job because there was so much filming, but also because productions have become shorter. And that's also to do with streaming. So people were exhausted going into this and sharing their stories, and this sort of, yeah, there's just this momentum built up, I think, even to a surprise to union leaders, that really they were able to call for a strike authorization, and they got an overwhelming, almost unanimous vote in favor. And they were going for, the usual things like increased pay, but also better turnaround times. I talked a bit about this turnaround. They had this thing called a Fraturday, which is effectively where working Friday would bleed into Saturday. So like you wouldn't get home until like the early hours of Saturday morning, or even like Saturday morning, basically, because you would wrap so late. So, they wanted protections to have like a core amount of weekend time. And also, like you mentioned, streaming residuals. Now, for IATSE workers, they don't get a check like an actor or a director might. Their residuals fund their pension. So to ensure that they have stable health and pension benefits going forward, they really need a bigger piece of that pie. And so, obviously, as streaming has made up a bigger part of the residuals compensation, the contribution towards their pension has gone down. So really it came to October when, that they had this huge momentum behind them. Ultimately, they didn't end up walking out, and it left a lot of acrimony, and it probably left the union the most divided it's probably ever been, because some members wanted them to push on and push for more, and others just wanted to get back to work. And another sort of phenomenon that's existing is that there's a lot of younger members, a lot more active members than there have been in recent years. And there was some sort of criticism maybe of saying, well, maybe people didn't really understand the process, because I think, the typical process that you start at the beginning and go in with certain demands, members wanted more. And so the representatives in the talks couldn't then sort of change up and say and ask for more than they actually initially went in for. That's not typically how negotiations go. So I think there was a bit of angst there, but it was very notable simply because they got this almost unanimous strike authorization, even though in the end they never ended up doing it.
Yeah, no, I think you've put it really well. And I remember in 2011, it was like there were all of these stories that were going around that were being published by mainstream outlets and smaller outlets, and fueled in part by, that Twitter account, IA Stories, and just how much more, I guess, open a lot of these workers were being about the conditions in the industry and the conditions that they were facing as things were changing in the industry, but also as there was all of this pressure to kind of, get things filmed again. There was, I'm sure, concern as well about filming within a moment of COVID. There's still a lot of COVID measures on a lot of film sets at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was also part of it. I mean, film was one of the industries where people went back to work very quickly. And it was because, and you could say it's a good thing, but because the industry was able to come up with these COVID protocols, which were involved testing, masking, also sick pay, right? So protections like that. That the unions were able to agree to, but it created quite tough working conditions as well. It added to the pressure and the stress. And people will also, I think one theme I've heard a lot over the past couple of years is that maybe part of the fun that people might have had of this job was taken away because they weren't able to socialize on set in the same way, during lunch or whatnot. You didn't have the same sort of lunch experience or socializing experience on set. Sometimes if you're on location, you'd be shut down in your hotel. So from that perspective, it was quite tough.
No, absolutely. Like, you can completely understand and sympathize with that, right? Completely changing. And that, I'm sure many workers have experienced that, right? How the pandemic has really changed the conditions of their work. Maybe that has come back a bit more toward where it was before, as, restrictions have lessened and stuff. But as I understand, they're still quite common in the film industry because of insurance reasons and things like that.
Well, I think, asking people to mask up, a lot of these are bargaining, are things that the unions believe are things that have to be negotiated and bargained. And so now that they have this sort of agreement in place, if you get rid of it, and I'm sure, it is slowly going away, that if you get rid of it, you have to get rid of all of it. And that means getting rid of things like sick pay. So it's sort of like okay, if you get rid of the testing, you throw the baby out with the bathwater is the expression obviously that people like to use. So that's the kind of reason why it's still around, is that it does offer some protections that people want. I mean, effectively, it will start to go away, because it does slow down production. It has slowed down production to some degree. So I'm sure eventually it will go.
Yeah, maybe that'll be part of some negotiations that'll be coming up in the next few months as well, I'm sure. So I do want to move on to, what is going on now. As you said, this is the year that the Writers Guild, that the directors, and that SAG-AFTRA will be negotiating new contracts. The expectation is that those contracts are supposed to be signed by around June, unless, of course, one of these unions go to strike because they, are not getting an agreement with the AMPTP. They're not agreeing on terms or conditions. And as you say, there was an expectation that this was going to happen in 2020, but because of the pandemic, obviously it was pushed off to this year. So when we look toward the next few months, what are some of the issues that are really kind of motivating the writers, the directors, and the actors? What are the things that they are looking to get out of these negotiations, recognizing that kind of the template that was put in place before is no longer working, in part because of what streaming has done to the industry, but I'm sure there are some other reasons there as well.
So we're at the stage where they still have to, set their pattern of demands, as it's called, besides the usual sort of pay, sustainability of their pension benefit and residuals, streaming pay. They haven't sort of laid those out yet. It's, I think, probably, negotiations for the writers who are contract expires first. What I've reported is that, they maybe expect to start negotiations in March. But I think the biggest thing will be streaming and compensation linked to streaming. And there's so many different elements that it affects. But one that immediately comes to mind that we haven't mentioned so far is that in that agreement from, say, 2007, and that's been every 3 years, it's been improved or renegotiated. Part of that is that streaming is still considered new media. And I think over the past couple of years, what there's been a sort of union move to say, well, it's not so new anymore. Part of it being new, and part of that agreement back in 2007 was that, well, let's give this new media a chance to evolve. And so those contracts actually have a discount. So it's actually, you get paid less for a production on streaming than you might for a main network like CBS. It does vary, so it's dependent on like how many subscribers the streaming platform has, for example. There are different gradations.
I remember there was a story in 2021, of course, as the IATSE negotiations were bringing a lot of attention to some of these issues, that Apple, even though it being a company with like a crazy amount of money sitting in the bank, it makes insane profits. It was probably at the time still the most valuable public company in the world by market cap. It was getting these discounted rates. It was not paying the full rate because it still fell into this category because it had so many subscribers, like not over a certain threshold. And it was like, how does this make any sense?
Yeah, and I think obviously a lot of the workers in Hollywood now are seeing that, and because these companies now make up a greater part of the AMPTP, it's all the more relevant. But I think this year the big theme will be about streaming, because since 2007 there have been, obviously every few years a renegotiation, but it does feel like, and I interviewed the president of the WGA, Meredith Steam, who's newly incoming in 2020. She really feels like this is a very important moment to be able to catch up. And I think writers have been saying for years, are we going to get left behind effectively by technology? And it's really fascinating when you reached out to me for this podcast. I obviously think about technology as being part of it, but I think this year, maybe more recent years, that it's going to be the most important, because we've seen such a transformation, spurred in part by the pandemic, towards how much content is now on streaming. I mean, obviously the pandemic did accelerate what was already happening, which was a shift away from going to the movies, say for film, and having an exclusive amount of time of maybe 3 months where a film was only visible in theaters. You had to go to the theater to see it. Now that was shrinking anyway, but it's come right down, and to the point that you've had people suing studios over the fact that they were forcing a lot of their content straight onto streaming and bypassing the theaters because, the theaters were shut down due to the pandemic. So, there's this very important lawsuit, which is Scarlett Johansson's lawsuit against Disney, which was ultimately settled. But I mean, you're talking potentially reportedly like tens of millions of dollars that she believed that she was owed because her movie Black Widow went straight to streaming and didn't go to theatrical. So if you can just imagine how much one person feels that they lost out there, and obviously she's an A-list star and you're talking about a Marvel property, but that was very contentious. And I think it says a lot about what's happening with the economics of Hollywood and what's at stake in these negotiations.
Yeah, absolutely. And around the same time, Warner did the same thing for its whole, I believe, 2021 slate. And instead of going to court like Disney did, it just kind of paid off the various directors and actors so that they would, not make too much of a fuss about it, even though some of them still did.
Yeah. And one of I remember, I think it was the Wall Street Journal reported a number of like $200 million is what they estimated they might have to pay out. And the unions do go up against and have won arbitrations against the streamers for not just streaming companies, but companies with streaming platforms about how much they paid. The WGA recently won an arbitration against Netflix in the summer where they won something like $42 million in unpaid residuals for, about 200 writers. So there's a lot at stake that, they're still sort of eking out and trying to keep on top of in terms of our writers, for example, being paid accurately.
Yeah. And as you say, it's one of the things is that now you have the studios owning their own, streaming platforms, and that creates an opacity where it's harder to actually judge, what residuals are supposed to be paid, and especially where there's less kind of selling the rights. As you mentioned before, you'd have the kind of theatrical release, then the home release, you might have pay-per-view, foreign distribution rights, all these sorts of things would create more sales, which would create more residuals and things like that. That doesn't really happen with streaming in the same way. And I know when we look at writers, one of the issues that they have as well is what's called mini rooms, where you're using fewer writers in order to put together these shows and things like that. And as we see on streaming, the seasons of television shows are typically more like, 8 to 10 episodes rather than, the 20 odd we used to get for like broadcast television series. What kind of impact do those sorts of things have?
Yeah, so it's not just this kind of dealing and the distribution platform that's changed, but also how the content itself has changed. So what writers might find now is that they are locked in, and it's true for actors. Actors also have these issues about exclusivity, but that might be locked in for, say, like a year to a room in which they work. They call them rooms, which they staff up with writers to work on a TV show. And because they get paid per episode sometimes, they might only do 6 episodes. And so they spend a huge amount of time, like a year, and get paid for very few episodes. So that's one, sort of specific issue. But in general, there are fewer episodes that are being made, but sometimes stretched out over longer periods of time. So that is, generally a bit of a bugbear for, writers. And it's fine to have fewer episodes, but I think that they want to obviously be paid more than to change the payment structure if that's going to be the way it is. And I think TV has changed so much. You don't have these long series anymore, but also it's become more theatrical, a lot of these TV shows, so the actual work that goes into each episode, it can be a lot more, and you can get like hour-long episodes, which have extremely high production values, to the point that in some places they actually just consider them films, effectively mini films. And then, there's this recent phenomenon, which I've seen some creators want this addressed, and this speaks to how things change so fast, if contract negotiations can keep up with them, is that streaming is going through a process of slimming down. It's going through this very competitive moment where it's having to retrench a little bit, which creates an even more difficult backdrop. But you're seeing a lot of shows and films cancelled, sometimes after they're made but never shown. So it's like a new phenomenon of like, well, some of these shows, even if they're popular, aren't going to get more than 1 or 2 seasons. And so that adds to the dynamics of the struggle for writers and performers.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I understand, a lot of the people who work on these shows could usually expect a raise around the third season. And that's when like Netflix and a lot of these streamers tend to be canceling the series and not continuing them, even if they can be quite popular. So there, as you've been discussing, there are a lot of issues here for the various workers on these productions to be concerned about, to want to renegotiate with the various studios and tech companies who are creating these shows and who own these streaming platforms. You reported recently that the Directors Guild is, instead of negotiating first, has decided to kind of let the writers go first and see what they kind of get out of this. How significant is that, do you think?
Yeah, to be accurate, they say that they might wait until their contract expiration as opposed to some years where they've decided to go early. It's kind of a fascinating sort of technical conversation, which really tells you a lot about the unions themselves. What has typically happened in recent years is that the Directors Guild has gone in much earlier than its contract expiration, which is in June, and it's struck a deal with the AMPTP early. Some may say, maybe they think that they'll get a benefit from giving producers, the assurity that, they're going to be able to make their slate of content that year without interruption. And maybe they give a better deal. The Writers Guild has a different perspective, and they, obviously it's not a monolith, but, every people within the guild have different views. But I quoted someone in my story, a WGA source, who said that deadlines make deals. And, if you've covered deal making, I've covered deal making in business. And that's quite a typical approach, is to wait until the final hour, until you have some leverage. So it's a very different negotiating approach that it seems that the WGA has. And one thing that the WGA has raised recently is that there's this thing called bargaining patterns. So, for example, the DGA would go first, and by agreeing a deal, there's this expectation on the behalf of the producers that that sort of sets a benchmark for what other unions have to, agree to. And I don't think, my interpretation is that I don't think the Writers Guild likes that too much. In fact, they've sort of said as much when they got this sort of landmark deal with Netflix last summer over residuals, getting them to pay out more for films that had been produced. That the Writers Guild said, effectively, they don't really like this bargaining pattern where, a producer might strike a deal with one union and then it sort of force that on another. So there hasn't, to my understanding, there's not been any like communication between the guilds about this, but the Directors Guild, unusually this cycle, has been very vocal, which, I think they've been trying to communicate to their members how difficult this round of bargaining is going to be, which foreshadows what this year could have in store in terms of strike action. And in the couple of member announcements that they've put out, which is, again, unusual, they're usually quite tight-lipped, they've said that they might wait until their contract expires, which would be after the WGAs, which would, by definition, mean that the Writers Guild could go first. And that could set a tone of potentially saying, like, okay, let the writers go first, see what they can achieve. But it paints this very interesting dynamic between the different unions about how these negotiations unfold. And they're not necessarily, working together, obviously, on that. So, yeah, I think it's going to be interesting. But we don't know what the DGA will do, but it's a possibility that the writers could go first, and they could set quite a combative tone for this year. The last time the writers went first was 2007. So does that tell us that, that we're necessarily going to have a strike this year? The WGA has told its members, it's too early to say whether or not they're going to strike. And sometimes they think it's sort of done on purpose to sort of put them on the back foot.
What would you put the chances of a strike at this point, do you think?
Well, we don't have a strikeometer. I think the hill that has to be climbed is so high that I think it's pretty likely, especially if the WGA goes first. But they have struck the most in the history of Hollywood. So by definition, it would mean they have the highest probability of striking of the union. So I just think that what has to be achieved is so high, especially as it comes when these streaming companies and the studios in general are struggling and they're dealing with a lot of losses and they are cutting back. So they're not going to be in the mindset of wanting to give away so much. But over these past 3 years, the economics of Hollywood has changed completely. And you can understand that, these creators don't want to be left behind. And that, I think as well, like, you do have younger members coming into these unions that are more active and want more, I suppose, and want to be more activist. So, I think it's going to be an interesting year. But I think at the same time, on the flip side, the talk of possible recession, could that take away anybody wanting to go on strike? People do remember that in 2007, a lot of people, what the studios did was they used a sort of force majeure, clause in contracts to be able to drop a lot of writers. So people lost jobs, lost their livelihoods, and many left Los Angeles and left the industry as a result of that strike. So it was very painful for a lot of people. So I don't think people are necessarily chomping at the bit to do that. Yeah, I mean, I would put it at a significant risk. But, every time when I look back at coverage of different strikes, there's been so many close calls over the years, since 2007, so I think people talk a lot about striking, and I think it's a good chance of it. I definitely don't think it's a given.
Yeah, as you say, there are really big issues that need to be tackled, but then at the same time, the streaming companies, the studios are facing difficulties. We saw last year with what happened with Netflix and its big share price declines because it reported a drop in subscribers and things like that. And then also, of course, we're in this position, we're in this moment where inflation has been going up, where there's the risk of the recession. That might make people a bit apprehensive about going on strike and not kind of having that income coming in for a while. One piece that I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned earlier was consolidation. We've obviously had these big tech companies move into the entertainment industry, Apple, Netflix, Amazon, and Amazon has recently bought MGM Studios. We also saw Disney buy Fox recently, a few years ago now. And there was the recent Warner Discovery merger. There have been other big acquisitions and mergers in recent years. What has that also meant for the workers as these studios and companies that they're negotiating with become larger and more powerful? Does that make it more difficult to get better terms?
Yeah, it's more consolidated, so there's less competition. So that's, one big issue. It also means, you have more of that issue of, some people call it self-dealing. Some people see that as a pejorative, but effectively what you're trying to say is that the producer and distributor are the same entity. So you don't have the visibility over how much is my content being valued at when a producer sells it to the distributor. I think what's interesting is that the composition of what we know as studios, Hollywood studios, has changed so much. So, the Warner Discovery deal, Discovery has a lot of non-union content, it's reality and unscripted. So I think that's going to be quite interesting. And also, so you have Amazon, Apple, and, tech companies, in general haven't been very open to organizing the labor movement. So I think that's fair to say. It's going to be interesting to see how this makeup affects the negotiations this time, but it's a very different landscape than it has been in other years.
Yeah, I think it's definitely going to be interesting to watch what happens, the negotiations that come of it and where it all ends up. Is there anything, that we didn't get to in this conversation that you think is important for the listeners to know as all this goes on that maybe I forgot to ask you about?
No, I do think that it's worth remembering that these are just sort of regular jobs for a part of the country. In Southern California, this is, just a very, very big industry. And it's not the glamorous work that people think it is. It can be grueling and dangerous and doesn't necessarily pay very well. I mean, don't get me wrong. I think that, when I've spoken to different crafts, people want all sorts of communities to be aware that this work is there and that it can be well paid. But it's not the sort of millionaire glamorous life that everybody sort of assumes it is. So I think it's worth keeping that in mind when we're talking about who's actually negotiating here. And I think the cutbacks that have been happening in Hollywood amongst the streamers, it does add a very complicating dynamic. And because at the same time, they will be under pressure in that they want to make sure that in the streaming war that's happening, where there's all these new streaming platforms, they're competing for eyeballs, they're competing for audiences. They don't want to be without their hottest shows. They don't want to be without their next big hit because they need that to keep people subscribed. I think that's something that's going to be very influential as well. I mean, just before the holidays, it's going around town, different sort of events, and you talk to executives, and definitely people are talking about the risk of a strike and starting to think already, how they're going to manage it. For some, that means bringing productions forward so that they can complete them. For others, it might mean, back in 2007, it led to the creation of The Apprentice. So, gave Donald Trump his big leg up there in TV. So, all sorts can come from the threat of a strike.
The unexpected consequences. But no, I think you've explained that really well. And I think it is important to emphasize that, just because we see some of these people, on the red carpets at the Oscars or the Golden Globes doesn't mean that that's the case for everyone who works in this industry. And there's a lot of people who just work regular jobs, working on these various productions to make this all happen. And it's important to keep that in mind, especially when these negotiations are going on and these workers are trying to get a better deal so that they can better survive on the work that they're doing. Anousha, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me on.
Anousha Sakoui is a reporter at the LA Times and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2022. You can follow her on Twitter at Anousha Sakoui. You can follow me at Paris Marx, and you can follow the show at Tech Won't Save Us. Tech Won't Save Us is produced by Eric Wickham and is part of the Harbinger Media Network. And if you want to support the work that goes into making it every week, you can go to patreon.com/techwon'tsaveus and become a supporter. Thanks for listening.